which will be shipped to your friend's address later, which we didn't. Then participants perform the latter version of the flanker task, and importantly, the half of the blocks for themselves, and the other half were for their close friends. And the order of the blocks was counterbalanced and did not influence the results. And I examined their error responses to assess their motivation underlying the pursuit of self-interest. So individuals may experience their errors as more threatening if the error is made in a task they perform to earn reward for themselves, compared to when such an error is made in the task they earn to increase their reward point for their close friends, as long as this person cares more about self-interest compared to the interest of their close friends. So I examined the intent size of RN compared to friend condition as a neurophysiological signal of self-centric motivation. And these are the waveforms from our European subjects. So as you can see, about 50 milliseconds after an error response, people do show ERN in the friend condition. And interestingly, these individuals show even larger ERN from the self condition, so suggesting a clear self-centric motivation characterizing these individuals. However, our Asians show very different patterns. They do show ERN, so they do care about their performance across both self and friend. However, the size of the error signal doesn't seem to be different across the conditions. And the statistical analysis confirmed that this cultural difference was significant. So European Americans showed higher ERN in the self condition compared to the friend condition. However, our Asian subjects' error signal did not differ as a function of condition. And in addition to these neural responses, I also examined their behavioral responses, specifically focusing on post-error flow. So previous studies suggest that the ERN is often accompanied by post-error slowing. So people tend to slow down their responses after making an error on a subsequent trial to improve their performance. So if European Americans really care about their performance in the self condition, as indicated by their intent size of the ERN in that condition, it may be expected that this would also show greater post-error slowing in the same condition. And this was exactly what we found. So European Americans showed higher significant post-error slowing in the self condition, but not in the friend condition. And Asians did not, post-error slowing was negligible across the two conditions. And finally, consistent with the view that interdependence individuals may show this weaker self-serving effects, self-centric effects. We found that self-centering effects on both ERN and post-error slowing were negatively predicted by interdependence. So meaning that the less interdependent individuals were, the greater ERN and greater post-error slowing they showed in the self blocks compared to the friend blocks. Okay, so to summarize in the first part, I presented two studies which suggest that defensive reaction to two types of self-threat, which is captured with the ERN amplitude, is significantly modulated by culture. And importantly, in both studies, the threat reaction occurred less than 100 milliseconds. So even before participants became aware of making their errors. So this highlights that culture modulates such early, even automatic processing of threat, depending on the symbolic meaning of threat that becomes salient in a given situation or context. Okay, so next, let me move on to the next part. So in this part, I examine how culture, as well as social status and condition, how these two macrosocial conditions predict the extent to which individuals express anger. I'm interested in anger because anger is considered as an important antecedent of aggression and violence, which is one of the most serious social problems nowadays in the United States. So violence rate is really high in the U.S. compared to other developed countries, and also this crime rate is on rise, is increasing every year. So recent years, so new technology to why people behave aggressively. And obviously, anger is one of the most relevant emotions. And of course, I'm not saying that anger expression and violence and aggression are the same thing. And so it is a form of violence and aggression does not involve experience or expression of anger. But still, I think it is important to examine the motivation or drive underlying the expression of anger to examine its potential link to violence. And anger is a very unique emotion because two seemingly contrasting motivations appear to drive the expression of these emotional states. And one common of anger is venting frustration. We feel frustrations when we are prevented from achieving our desired goal states. And it is well established in social psychology that frustrations that stem from the blocked personal goals in turn lead to create some readiness and urge to express anger and behave aggressively. Yet, there's another very important function of anger. So people often display anger, express anger to display or manifest anger. And people liberty to express this kind of anger to assert their social position, social rank hierarchy. And one very useful way to examine the underlying motivation of anger expression is social status. So if anger is properly expressed to vent frustration, maybe that lower status individuals they express anger more compared to their higher status individuals. In contrast, if anger is more likely expressed to display dominance or others, higher status individuals who have more dominance and power over others may be expected to express anger compared to lower status counterparts. And obviously, both types of anger expressions are present in Western Asian society. But I expect that the extent to which each of these two aspects of anger expression may be more salient or common or emphasized occurs. Accordingly, the direction of the relationship between social status and anger expression may also likely to depend on culture. And when we examine the relationship between the two, at least in Western cultural context, there are already evidence which suggests some negative relationship between the two. So evidence is mounting that those with individuals with lower social standing show more aggressive and violent behaviors compared to higher status individuals. And given this evidence, it may be expected that lower status individuals may also anger more compared to their higher status individuals. However, and this prediction actually fits well with the idea, my prediction that the anger in Western cultural context may primarily stem from frustration. So in Western cultural context where independence is highly sanctioned, people show strong commitment to their personal goals because this reinforces their sense of authority. However, when people encounter certain situational constraints that interfere with their goal pursuit, they are likely to become highly frustrated. And anger in this culture may then reflect such frustration that's stemming from the blocked personal goals. And as one social standing becomes lower, this person is likely to experience more frustration in their life because this person may have more situational constraints in their life which interfere with their goal pursuit. And this is the reason why I expect that the relationship between social status and anger expression to be negative in Western cultural context, with lower status individuals express anger more compared to higher status individuals. However, the aforementioned evidence linking lower social status to greater violence or dominance, this evidence comes nearly exclusively from Western cultural context. So it is possible that this negative relationship the predicted relationship between social status and anger expression may be limited to independent Western cultural context in which venting frustration function of anger is more common. In contrast, in Asian cultures, a greater premium is placed on interdependence with others. And cultural emphasis on interdependence creates strong prohibitions against expression of anger because this can threaten the ever-important relationship with other people. However, all individuals are expected to suppress their anger in this society. Some may still that their anger expression is culturally permitted and socially justified. And those who have power such privilege in Asian society. And as one social standing becomes higher, this person is likely to enjoy more dominance and power over others. This is the reason why that the relationship between social status and anger expression to be positive in Asian cultures, with high status individuals express anger more compared to their low status counterparts. And we found a perfect example to support my Asian prediction. So many of you may have heard about this. Back in December, a Korean woman named Cho Hyun-ha, daughter of the chairman of Korean Airlines, and at that time a vice president of this company, was angry just because the flight attendant in the first class served a snack, macadamia nut, in a bag, not on a plate. So she was so upset that she ordered the pilot to take the flight back to the gate at John F. Kennedy Airport in New York City so that a senior crew member could be kicked off the flight. Seriously, it happened. So, yeah, this clearly shows an exceptional case, obviously exceptional case in which someone's anger expression is not justified at all, even if it was from a high-status individual. But many Koreans were I heard display of entitlement in the form of anger display because this kind of anger expression is so common in their culture. This clearly indicates that in Asian cultural context, high individuals have anger privilege and they often for reasons, for nuts. And so to examine whether the data are really consistent with seemingly exceptional case, I tested my predictions by examining two forms of social status. So individuals vary in the way they gauge evaluate their relative standing in their society. Some rely on their subjective perceptions based on their assessment, subjective perceptions about their relative standing. Some may rely on more objective indicators such as educational attainment or occupational status. So individuals are likely to use both types of information to judge their relative standing in their community or society. But a recent study that my collaborators and I did show a very interesting cultural difference in the relative significance of these two types of social status. And consistent with the previous evidence that direct appraisal of the self individuals, such as focusing on how I think about me and my social position. So it was subjective social status which predicted their positive psychological functioning more strongly. And in contrast, also consistent with the previous evidence that reflected appraisal of the self and situation is more important for interdependent individuals, such as focusing on how other people surrounding me think about me and my social position. It was objective social status which predicted Asians' positive psychological functioning better. So given this evidence, I examined two types of social status as predictors of anger expression in my study. And I used publicly available data set, cross-cultural surveys to test my predictions. So I used a well-known survey that was collected in the United States called Midas, in the United States, Midas. And the companion survey was obtained in Japan, called Midlife in Japan, MIJA. And as you can see, the two cultural groups were pretty much similar in terms of demographic variables, although Americans were slightly higher in terms of educational attainment compared to Japanese. And assess anger expression based on the anger expression out subscale developed by Spitberger. So respondents were asked to indicate the extent to which they engage in each behavior when they feel angry or furious. And this is what I found. So as you can see, you can find the main effect of culture. So as I said before, anger is generally more suppressed in Japan compared to the United States. But this main effect of culture is qualified by a significant cultural by social status interaction. So as predicted, and as you can see, I found a strong negative relationship between social status and anger expression among Americans, implying that lower status individuals express anger more compared to their higher status individuals. But importantly, this relationship was evident when I examined subjective social status. And in contrast, I found a strong positive relationship between social status and anger expression among Japanese, implying that higher social status Japanese express anger more compared to the lower counterpart. And importantly, this evidence was obtained only when I examined objective social status. And subsequent mediation analysis confirmed my prediction by showing that the negative relationship between subjective social status and anger expression was mediated by some feeling frustration among our American participants. So it suggests that lower subjective social status lead to greater feelings of frustration, which in turn fewer anger expression in the United States. And also consistent with anger as dominance display hypothesis, I found that the positive relationship between objective social status and anger expression was mediated by self-report level of decision authority people have in the setting. So this indicates that higher status, objective social status Japanese have more decision authority in their careers setting, which in turn enable them to express anger more compared to the lower status counterparts. Okay, so to summarize in this section, the data that I presented in this section suggests that culture and two forms of social status jointly interact to predict the extent to which individuals express anger. And so two cultural groups show diametrically opposite relationship between status and anger expression, depending on the prominent function of anger expression that is salient and more emphasized in given cultural context. And one interesting future extension of this work is to examine whether the way people deal with the aftermath of anger expression is so different across the cultures. So in response to the simmering public anger about the nut rage incident in Korea, Cho's father, chairman of Korean Airlines, publicly apologized for his daughter's food, blaming himself that he did not raise her better. So I think this also shows a clear contrast. So it's interesting and important to test cultural differences in the effectiveness of different types of projects or different types of responses to deal with expression of negative emotions. Okay, finally, let me move on to the last part of my talk, in which, so to examine real-life health implications of the previous study on culture and anger expression, I examined whether culture also influences. It's common belief that anger is bad for health. But the foregoing evidence I just showed you earlier implies that this relationship between anger expression and health is also likely to depend on culture. So my previous analysis suggests that in the United States, anger expression serves as an indicator of frustration. So it may signify self people face in their lives, some of which may come from being in lower social status. And given this evidence, it can be hypothesized that anger expression will be linked with compromised health among Americans. In contrast, anger provides a different function in Japan. Anger expression serves as an indicator of dominance and power. So it signify all the layers of affirmations of the self as dominant and powerful, and being included being in higher social status. And given this evidence, that anger expression may be linked to even better health for Japanese. And consistent with our prediction for Americans, extant literature suggests that there is a anger expression and hostility are strongly related to mortality, at least in Western culture. And this increasing evidence suggests that this part, at least in part, mediated by inflation. However, it remains unknown how anger expression is related to these biomarkers among Japanese, whose anger expression may signify a different social condition. So I to examine this issue, I compared Americans and Japanese in terms of levels of cardiovascular risk assessed with systolic blood pressure and total HDL cholesterol, and also assessed inflammation based on interleukin 6 and C-reactive protein. And biomarkers were highly correlated to each other, and both confirmatory and exploratory factor analysis provided a one-factor solution, which suggests that these four biomarkers represent coherent factor for biological health risk for both cultural groups. So for analysis, we use the score as an index of biological health risk. But when we examine each biomarker separately, we found consistent pattern of cultural differences. And we used biomarker samples of Midas and Mika. So as you can see, we have a similar number of Japanese patients in this sample, but they were pretty much similar in terms of demographic values. And also in our analysis, we controlled for a variety of factors that can contribute to biological risk, including their demographic variables, health conditions, health behaviors, and even social status. And first, we found huge main effect of culture. So as compared to Americans, Japanese are lower in all four measures of health. And I think it's a very interesting finding. This interesting main effect of culture was qualified by expected culture by anger expression interaction. So as we predicted and also consistent with earlier findings linking anger expression to ill health, we found a positive relationship between anger expression and biological health risk among our American respondents. But our data also shows that this well-established relationship is by no means culturally universal. So we found a significant negative relationship between anger expression and biological health among Japanese, implying that with anger expression, their biological risk goes down. And it is notable that this cultural difference is observed even when we control for social status, both objective and subjective. So this cultural difference is not explained by any relationship between social status and health or social status and anger expression. Okay, so to summarize the data I presented here in this section, culture influences the relationship between anger expression and biological health. And it also highlights this is not just the behavior act of anger expression that matters for health, but it is the associated anger expression signifies, which is culture specific in this case, is the key mechanism that is driving the relationship between anger expression and health. And this also suggests that sociocultural factors can go under the skin to influence wider biological processes underlying health outcomes. Okay, so before concluding, let me spend a few minutes to talk about my current and future research directions, which directly follow from my program of work on culture, and they will continue in 3 different directions. However, it is important to recognize that the studies that I have presented so far have relied on comparisons between Asian versus Western, European American, or Americans in general comparisons. Though, and it's true that contrast has provided a number of invaluable insight about the nature of cultural influences. However, I think that field now should be pushing forward in 3 different directions by examining its subgroups. And in this vein, recently I have begun to examine race as another important social factor that influences emotional competencies. And building on my earlier finding that different functions across socio-cultural contexts, I am currently examining health correlates of anger among African Americans by focusing on the potential causal link from anger to biological health. And in our study that is the race, I reversed the relationship between the two and examining how neurobiological factor may alter anger expression. And I do so specifically by manipulating oxytocin, the hormone that is known to promote positive social outcomes such as trust and cooperation. Specifically, I'm examining whether the lack of trust is the mechanism that underlies strained interracial interactions. I'm using whether this manipulation of how intranational manipulation of oxytocin influences their response responses either to social rejection or social acceptance by an outgrown partner in the lab setting, the dyadic actions, by assessing their autonomic nervous system activity and as well as their neuroendocrine responses. And second, the emotion model that I have presented so far has primarily focused on how culture influences emotional processing that occurs within individuals. However, emotions are not just static that precisely live in our human minds, but they translate different individuals and influence those around us. For example, examining affect contagion, through which the one person's affective state is transmitted to another person, can have important implications for understanding dyadic social consequences such as development of trust, cooperation, or even conflict. However, remarkably little is known on how culture influences this affective process. And I aim to address this issue in the next 5 years by measuring affect contagion of psychophysiology, which allows for temporal precision to examine subtle affective changes over time between dyadic interactions. So, for example, affect contagion can be assessed in the form of physiological symptoms. So, if one person's physiological response, such as sympathetic nervous system, is highly correlated with the other person's physiological response that is extracted from the same time frame, this could serve as a physiological index of affect contagion within this dyad. So using this methodology, I plan to new questions that surround the role that culture plays in modulating this affective process. So for example, is affect contagion facilitated in European Americans compared to Asian dyads, or is the opposite true? And if there's cultural difference identified, what is the underlying mechanism? So what is the channel through which one group's affect contagion is more facilitated or attenuated over the other? And what are the social consequences of affect contagion? And how culture influences affect contagion within this dyad or even a larger team with more than 3 or 4 people? And I think addressing these questions can have important implications for understanding the process underlying the development of not only positive social outcomes such as trust or cooperation or liking, but also negative social outcomes such as conflict and suspicion or mistrust. And if this line of work could identify some mechanisms underlying the positive social outcomes of affect contagion or cultural modulation of it, and this mechanism could be integrated into some interventions or practices to facilitate conflict resolution or even to promote positive outcomes such as trust, not only within but also across different groups. And this is one important future direction of research I'd like to pursue for the next 5 years. And finally, the final direction of the work is just to extend my earlier work on emotion regulation. So as I briefly mentioned at the beginning of my talk, in my second program of work, I examine psychosocial conditions that allow people to adaptively regulate their intense emotional responses in a way that promote their health and well-being. And I do so specifically focusing on people's capacity to examine their responses without becoming overwhelmed based on self-distancing. So self-distancing is an emotion regulatory process which allows people to take a step back their intense emotional responses so that they can see themselves in the event from afar. So in turn, lead them to think more rationally about the problem from a self-distanced third-person perspective. So one interesting future extension of this book would be to examine how whether culture modulate this process as other regulatory mechanisms such as reappraisal and suppression, and how this emotion regulatory process lead to health outcomes. And in addition to examining people's capacity to regulate their emotions, I also examine how other people surround us help us to regulate our emotions. And one very useful way to address this issue is to examine how people use social networks such as Facebook in regulating their state. And Facebook is a very unique cultural environment, not only because people increasingly use the social media to connect with others, and it also rapidly changes the way people disclose their emotions and also provide and receive support. And also, what I really like about this social media is because it provides a novel methodological approach to examine the process of emotional disclosure or social support transaction more objectively based on the Facebook activity occurred and documented in vivo on participants' Facebook world data. So using this methodology to assess emotional processes more objectively, which is not possible usually more difficult in offline settings, I want to extend my earlier work on Facebook. For example, by examining how individuals who may have social support deficits in their offline settings, such as those with depression or other mood disorder or social anxiety, how these individuals use Facebook or online social network in general to regulate their emotions, and how social support transactions using the social media influence their health outcomes. Okay, so to recap, going back to my mother, I'm interested in examining emotional responses people experience when they deal with negative life events. And the scope of my research covers the entire spectrum of emotional processing, ranging from initial automatic reaction, more slower, consciously accessible feelings and expression of it, and how they respond influence health outcomes. And my research strives to understand the sequence of emotional processing, first by examining culture as a way to understand meaningful differences in emotional responses, and second, examining regulation as a way to understand the underlying process through which emotional responses link to health outcomes. So extending this model by examining other psychosocial models as well as psychological and physiological mediators underlying this sequence, and extending this model not only within the individual but also capture states that occur across different individuals will make me to contribute to more complete and nuanced cultural shaping of emotional process. So let me end by thanking to my collaborators and excellent mentors. And finally, thank you all for your attention. Any questions? Yeah.
You look at sex education, do you think within cultures, subcultures, sex
So, do you have any questions about any particular study overall? Yeah. So that's a really important question, and I address whether these findings are moderated by gender, which is another very important